Today's topic is secrecy. Much of the secrecy that is endemic in our government today originated around the time of the Manhattan Project. There was secrecy before that, but the Manhattan Project was deemed to be so secret that the places where it was carried out were not on any map. Everybody in town had the same post office box address, and the people working at these sites were virtual prisoners. They could go into town on weekends. They could sometimes get a pass for a particularly important family event like a funeral. But for the most part, they were confined in the areas that were patrolled by the Army. Secrecy was introduced into nuclear research not by the Army, but by the scientists themselves. In the early days, 1939, there were some publications in scientific journals about research on nuclear fission, which had just been discovered in Germany. But when the scientists became aware of the potential use of this work to create weapons of war, they stopped sharing information. They voluntarily closed down publication of their work. And this actually had the opposite effect that they wanted. Some alert Soviet scientists noticed the sudden cessation of publications on nuclear fission and informed Joseph Stalin that something was afoot in the nuclear field in the West. When the Army took over the project, they continued the secrecy and introduced another level called compartmentalization. The principle was that every person working on the project would know exactly as much as they needed to know to do their job and no more. Compartmentalization caused a lot of trouble, and Robert Oppenheimer argued with Groves to do away with compartmentalization, at least at Los Alamos. Los Alamos was the smallest and the most secret of the Manhattan Project installations. Only about 2,300 scientists, average age of about 27 years old, compared with 75,000 at Oak Ridge and 60,000 at Hanford, Washington. But they were the ones designing and building the actual bombs. And so that was the most secret part of the project's work. One thing that's not widely publicized about security clearances is that everyone comes with an NDA. That's a non-disclosure agreement. And in the case of nuclear work, the NDA is for your lifetime. So basically what you do, the bargain you make with the devil when you get a security clearance to work on these secret matters, is that you give up your freedom of speech on this subject. For your whole life, you are forbidden from speaking about any of the secret information that you have access to. Secrecy gives rise to corruption of various kinds. As one example, one of my fellow graduate students, when I was in graduate school at the University of California, had worked on a secret project for a summer. And at the end of the summer, he wrote up a report on his work and handed it in. And several days later, he was told that he could no longer have access to that report because it had been classified beyond his clearance level. So, what's going to happen to that report is that someone who does have a higher classification is going to claim the work. They're going to say that they supervised this work, they practically did it all, and take the credit for it in the community of security-cleared individuals who are now the only ones who can read it. An even greater abuse of security is utilizing the NDA in order to shut someone out of the security-cleared community. The most famous example of this was Robert Oppenheimer himself. Robert Oppenheimer was a very brash young man, and he managed to make an enemy of Louis Strauss. Later on, when Louis Strauss became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, he conspired with Edward Teller, who hated Oppenheimer for other reasons, and the two of them managed to get Oppenheimer's security clearance revoked. As a result, Oppenheimer was done as an advisor on nuclear matters, in spite of the fact that he knew more about these matters than any other civilian. Classified documents are not intended to be classified forever. There are 3 important dates: 25, 50, and 75 years after the initial classification, when the classification is to be reviewed and in most cases ended. So I'm looking forward to 2020 because that will be 75 years after 1945, and almost everything in the Manhattan Project should be reviewed and released. I don't think it will be, but it should be. I want to show you a couple of pages from General Groves's Secret History of the Manhattan Project. First, here is a cover sheet, and you can tell from this cover sheet that it's gone through a lot of changes. Starting at the bottom, Restricted Data, Atomic Energy Commission, crossed out. Next up from that, Department of Energy Review, crossed out. And finally, classification canceled, Department of Energy. Now, I'd like to say that when this 14,000-page document was released, there was a lot of information available. You can download this thing from the Department of Energy website. But if you look at the top of this sheet, it says this document consists of 194 pages, number 3 of 4 copies. There were only ever 4 copies of this document made, and some of them are almost impossible to read. Take a look at this page. The information at the top here is extremely difficult to read. This looks like it was originally either a mimeograph or a ditto master that was used to make these 4 copies, and these are the only 4 copies there are, and there's really only one in the hands of the Department of Energy. So if you can't read it, too bad. This is the official history. And finally, I'd like to give an example of disinformation by selective declassification. I don't know how many of you followed the news broadcasts at the time of Saddam Hussein's efforts to make nuclear weapons in Iraq before the Iraq War. But his scientists were attempting to use electromagnetic separation of uranium isotopes, which is the absolute worst way to go about it. If you go to Oak Ridge today, you can see where they used to have 9 electromagnetic separation plants, none of which are in use anymore. And you can see the 1 half-mile long gaseous diffusion separation plant, which is not in use anymore. But what is still being used is a smaller installation of gas centrifuges. Of these 3 methods, gas centrifuges are the easiest and cheapest. Gas diffusion is next, And the electromagnetic separation method is terrible. It really doesn't work very well, and it takes an awful lot of energy to carry it out. So, our clever government released the information on the electromagnetic separation methods first, and they successfully trapped the Iraqi scientists into going after the worst possible way of enriching uranium.